Well, thank you very much for joining us today, where we're going to talk about loopers and the pioneers of self-tech. So to start with Australian custom, we acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country we are meeting on today, or at least myself and Densearn are. We recognize their continued connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this coastline and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nation people present today. I added on there this artwork that was commissioned actually by Diabetes Australia. I stole it from the website, made by an Aboriginal artist called Keisha Leon. That's a URL where you can find more information about this artwork that tells the story of diabetes within the Aboriginal Australian community, who, according to Diabetes Australia, still have almost 4 times more likeliness to suffer from diabetes, principally type 2, within the Australian population, almost 4 times more chance than other Australians. So how did this event come to life? So this slide talks about me, actually. It presents my journeys through open source medical technology, which started with helpful engineering, where I met Densearn, who would be one of our panel members. At the beginning of the pandemic, we joined helpful engineering to try to design, deploy, and distribute and use open source solution for the crisis. We had a lot of success with protective equipment. It was a great experiment, really, to investigate and explore new way of making medical technology. So that's already something I was doing professionally, but I was interested to try to do more also as a volunteer. So this whole exercise gave me a lot of opportunity to connect and meet with many sorts of people. I've been spending a lot of time with regulators and consultants working in regulations. I've been working with a lot of entrepreneurs. I've been working with a lot of open source volunteers who sometimes want to 3D print a solution for everything. I've been working with accelerators, incubators, university researchers, and humanitarian engineers and humanitarian organizations. I've been doing some presentations and seminars about those, trying to make the world of open source and the world of medical development work together a little bit better, to know maybe more from each other. This, I would say, culminated, the manifesto I put on the bottom right, this culminated by something I call Open Health Tech, which was a very informal meetup group. We have met, I think, 3 times, and presenting some project, research program, prototypes, communities, and just talking to each other within this group of open source medical technology enthusiasts. And this change, in the context of this effort, we were all looking for example of how to do things. Because in medical technology, to commercialize a solution legally in compliance with regulation, one of the common core of this process is that you have to document a lot of things. You have to have a quality system, you have to have a technical file, etc., etc. There's a lot of vocabulary around this documentation, but that's the common core. You always need to document a lot of things. And one of the fundamentals of open source is that everything is online for people to observe, to inspire from, to copy, to fork, when you can start a new project starting with the same code, but then to develop something new. So that was the way of the open source to work. And in medical technology, it was very hard to follow the same principle because everything is secret. You can't find anything online. of course, companies protect the IP. So the technical files, the quality system, all that is hidden. And one day I realized that a company called Tidepool was actually partnering with the American FDA, so the all-powerful regulator of food and medical technology in the US, to develop their closed-loop system that they would keep open source, and they shared all their documentation in their website. So of course, for me, that was a big, yeah, we found something that could help all these open source enthusiasts to have an example of how are you supposed to write a documentation if you want to do things the right way, like the commercial, corporate, and proper commercial inventors of medical technology can do. They are more than that because actually Tidepool is part of 8 companies that have been chosen by the FDA to partner with them to establish a future process to regulate product with AI. Now, because in AI, of course, there's always this concept of, yeah, we get approved for one product, but then we want to update our model with the new data we get from the real world. We want to continuously update to improve our model. And that's a challenge, regulatorily speaking. The way to address this challenge for the FDA has been to put this pilot program in place with, again, 8 partners, and one of them is an open source company. So for me, that was really a big yes moment. I also met online Anthony from the Open Insulin Foundation. I thought, yeah, that's interesting, because that's another thing where it's quite a big thing already commercially. The Open Insulin Foundation is trying to find a different open source, more transparent way maybe into the same type of technology. And it started to all fit together. Then my friend Che, who is living with type 1 diabetes, her and her son have been living with type 1 diabetes, and got access to in Australia, to the new model of closed loop system from Medtronic, and was of course talking with me about it. And she was invited to present her experience to a Diabetes Australia event. So I was very keen to go with her, and going to this event opened my eyes on the size and the richness of the community around all this, all the family members, the people with diabetes themselves, of course, the doctors, the researchers, the industry. And talking about community, I also met Jasmine on a local community here in Australia called What the Health, was created by our friend Emily Kazé. And Jasmine and I were introducing ourselves on the forum, I think on Slack. And so, of course, when Jasmine mentioned PhD, I thought, oh gosh, well, all this is coming together. That's great. I will be able now to learn more about this, because I don't know anything myself. I didn't know anything myself about this earlier until I discovered like these 4 elements. So I thought it was a great opportunity to put something together, and instead of just learning for myself, maybe to try to put this small event together to share this learning experience with my friend from the open source community. So that was the introduction. That's pretty much it. We're gonna start now by Jasmine's presentation, which should go for around 20 minutes. And after that, I'm gonna present the members of the panel, and we're gonna discuss a few of the questions raised by Jasmine during her presentation. And the purpose today was really not to have academic kind of seminar, but to have really an open discussion. So as soon as we have discussed maybe 20-25 minutes with the panel, even maybe shorter if we have a lot of questions, we will open the floor to audience questions and create breakout rooms so people can mingle and connect and share details easily. The URL at the bottom, so tinyurl.com/selftech-pioneers. I invite you to open that. That's a Google Drive folder that I set up in commenting mode. So everyone should be able to add whatever they want. If they want to share links, if they want to share news, if they want to share contact details, if they want to share PDF documents or anything, this event is really for connecting and sharing. So with no further ado, I'll maybe give the mic to Jasmine and let you present, Jasmine. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Pierre. I'll just share my screen. So good morning, everyone, or good evening if you're joining elsewhere in the world today. My name is Jasmine Schipp, and my presentation today will focus on our research on people with type 1 diabetes who are using open source artificial pancreas systems. I'd like to thank Pierre for inviting me to speak today. So this is the outline of my talk today. First, I'll briefly talk a bit about type 1 diabetes and explain what an open source artificial pancreas system is. I'll talk about our research on why people choose to use these devices, what we know about the benefits and challenges, how people navigate these challenges, and what healthcare professionals can do to support this group. And finally, I'll talk about people's perceived future of artificial pancreas systems. So to understand artificial pancreas systems, you need to know a bit about type 1 diabetes. The pancreas is an organ that sits behind the stomach, and this usually produces insulin, which helps regulate glucose levels. But people with type 1 diabetes have to inject insulin every day because their pancreas doesn't work properly. They also need to check that these glucose levels haven't gone dangerously low or high. And this constant checking and decision-making can be overwhelming and stressful. People with type 1 diabetes face the impossible task of trying to imitate a fully functioning pancreas 24/7. To imitate a pancreas, people with type 1 diabetes need to check their glucose levels to inform how much insulin they need. So there's technology that allows people to check their glucose levels via a continuous glucose monitor, which is also called a CGM, and to administer insulin via a pump. But there's a common misconception that this technology means that people no longer have to make decisions about how much insulin they need. However, even the most advanced insulin pumps and CGMs don't talk to each other, and so they still require the person to calculate how much insulin they need. Recently, new technology has been developed that overcomes these limitations. Commercial hybrid closed-loop devices allow for this communication and decision-making. These devices automatically adjust insulin levels based on information from the glucose sensor, aiming to keep these glucose levels within a safe target range. However, progress has been slow due to regulatory processes. For example, there's only one commercial closed-loop device available in Australia, and this didn't fully come onto the market until 2019. People in the diabetes community were tired of waiting for this commercial solution. So they combined the existing diabetes technology with new software to create an open source artificial pancreas system. Like commercial devices, this technology allows a CGM and insulin pump to talk to each other, and it automates insulin delivery using an algorithm. But this software was created by people with diabetes, for people with diabetes, and it's given away for free. Furthermore, people were able to use these open source devices before commercial ones were available. Users share online instructions to help other people to build their own systems. They chat on social media to troubleshoot problems, and they have build parties where they meet up in person to help each other build their system. It's estimated currently that there's over 2,500 people worldwide using these systems, and this number is continuing to grow. However, as open source artificial pancreas systems are created by the community, they aren't regulated or approved medical devices, and this can create challenges for the user. It's important to understand the experiences of this group because it indicates what's currently missing from diabetes management. And there's also broader implications in terms of open source healthcare movements more generally. So, why would someone choose to use one of these devices? We collaborated with the Open Project to do some work into this. The Open Project is an international group comprised of patient innovators, clinicians, and researchers who are investigating various aspects of open source APS. We worked with them to find out the reasons why people choose to use these systems. Mainly, They aimed to improve glucose levels and to reduce the risk of acute and long-term complications. When it came to comparisons of commercial systems, most people agreed that the availability of commercial devices was a motivation. Some were motivated to build an open source system because they felt that commercial devices weren't suitable, and less people agreed with the cost of the commercial devices being a motivation. In this study, people were also asked to self-report their glucose levels before and after using an open source APS. Participants reported that their glucose levels improved. For example, one measure of glucose levels is the percentage of time that people are spending in a safe range, so not going too high or not going too low. And participants reported that their time in this range increased from 63% to 80%. Other research has also shown an improvement in glucose levels for those using open source artificial pancreas systems. A review of the literature found that several benefits are reported consistently. These are decreased HbA1c, increased time in range, reduced glucose variability, reduced episodes of hypoglycemia, less reliance on the accuracy of carbohydrate counting, improved overnight control, and reduced cognitive burden. We conducted interviews in Australia to learn more about these benefits for people in their own words. Compared to their previous diabetes management, participants reported a range of benefits, including more stable glucose levels, better sleep quality, and reduced cognitive and time burden. Participants found it much easier than before to keep their glucose levels within a safe range. And they were sleeping better because they weren't having to wake up to treat highs or lows overnight, whereas previously some participants reported waking as often as 5 times a night. They didn't have to think about their diabetes as much, and participants stated that they felt they got back an hour of their time every day that they usually would have spent doing diabetes-related tasks. Overall, people felt that they were doing a lot less work for far better outcomes. However, participants also described multiple challenges. Some participants struggled with some of the technical aspects, such as coding their app. And it was often stated that you had to be quite tech savvy in order to build one of these systems. Sometimes it was hard to find the right pieces that they needed, especially secondhand, out of warranty devices or specialty medical equipment that had to be ordered from overseas. Participants described having some concerns about potential risks, such as using older or out of warranty devices or using software that had not received regulatory approvals. Finally, as participants were not using a regulated device, they could not seek advice on some aspects of the management from health professionals in industry. Participants reported a range of experiences of health professionals, both positive and negative. Some professionals were also described as not being very knowledgeable about this technology, which participants found challenging. Participants used 4 key strategies to navigate these challenges. Firstly, peer support was available online 24/7 for assistance with technical issues in sourcing hardware. For those who did not feel very tech savvy, peer support was essential to their build. The second strategy was self-sufficiency. Participants had to learn to build their system and troubleshoot issues without the help of health professionals. Participants shared some ambivalence here about feeling both more empowered, but also more burdened. They felt that they had much more control over their condition, but this also involved more responsibility. The third strategy was risk management. Participants were acutely aware of the potential risks and demonstrated a conscious weighing up of risks versus the benefits. They did not believe that what they were doing was any riskier than their previous management. They also carried backup devices in case anything went wrong. Some participants did not perceive it as a risk to use a system that was developed by people with diabetes rather than by a medical company. And in fact, some believed that it was advantageous as the developers had built it for themselves and were therefore very motivated to ensure their own safety. Finally, there were some challenges participants couldn't resolve, but they felt that the benefits outweigh these challenges. For example, although there were financial costs associated with running one of these systems, participants felt that it was worth it for the health and quality of life benefits they experienced. As a result, they felt more hopeful about their future with diabetes. They expected to live longer and to have a decreased risk of diabetes-related complications. Overall, participants reported that the rewards outweigh the cons, and it was all worthwhile. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the weighing up of risks that is involved when deciding to use an open source APS. As I said earlier, Participants in our study didn't believe that what they were doing was any riskier than their previous management. So there's been a really interesting piece published by Dana Lewis last year on a net risk safety analysis of open source artificial pancreas systems. Dana Lewis is one of the inventors of the technology. She has type 1 diabetes and she uses an open source artificial pancreas system. And in this paper, she argues that the risks of these devices are often overestimated, while the daily and ongoing dangers of living with diabetes are overlooked. Insulin dosing is hard to do manually. Giving too much or too little insulin is a risk, and mistakes can be made. Open source APS also has risks. The system could stop working or the CGM data could be inaccurate. However, Dana Lewis argues that overall, using an open source APS reduces risk compared to manually dosing insulin by reducing human error. And this is why many people say they feel safer using these systems than they ever did previously living with diabetes. So I also wanted to talk a little bit today about the support that people wanted from their health professionals. As one of the challenges participants described in the study was a lack of support and understanding. What can health professionals do to better support this group? And what sort of support are they expecting? So I think it's important to talk here about what participants were expecting their health professionals not to do. They understood that they couldn't do certain things. They didn't expect them to know how to code or know all the technical details. They knew that health professionals couldn't condone or recommend these better unregulated systems or give specific help or assistance for some aspects of the open source artificial pancreas systems. They also stated that they didn't want health professionals to talk extensively about the risks, as they were already aware of these, and they also felt that their previous management had also involved risks. And this relates to the point from Dana Lewis was making that I showed you in the previous slide. What participants did want was for their health professionals to educate themselves about open source artificial pancreas systems, to learn what it was, and to be interested. They wanted their health professionals to be supportive, open-minded, and positive. They wanted their health professionals to be accepting of their choice. They wanted them to know about open source artificial pancreas systems and to understand what they were talking about. And finally, the most important thing they wanted from their health professionals was for them to support their management. And I think it's important to note here that participants do not want health professionals to do anything that could get them into trouble. In fact, what they're asking for is what's recommended in the official position statement published by Diabetes Australia. And this position statement states that although these devices cannot be recommended by health professionals to people with diabetes, these people should continue to receive support and care from the diabetes health professionals and the health system. As part of these interviews, we also asked participants their perspectives on the future of artificial pancreas systems, and this has been published in a separate paper. The results of our study showed that participants anticipated commercial systems becoming much more common in the future, and they hope that this will provide many more choices for people with type 1 diabetes. However, they believe that in order for these systems to become mainstream, there would need to be faster regulatory approval processes and subsidies for diabetes technology in Australia. And I think this is a really important point to acknowledge. People can only uptake the latest technologies if they're available and affordable to them. We also asked participants if they would ever switch to a commercial system. Participants believe that open source systems were much more advanced than the currently commercial options, which are described as suboptimal. They expressed diverse views on using commercial systems in the future. Some stated that they would never swap to a commercial device. However, others stated that they would transition to a commercial system in the future if it was an improvement on how they were currently managing their diabetes, if it was under warranty, or if it was easier to use in an open source artificial pancreas system. At present, and for the foreseeable future, participants perceived that open source APS was their best option available to them. They perceived open source artificial pancreas systems to have several important features that offered them more choice, ownership, and real-time support than is currently possible with commercial devices. And many of these benefits are due to open source APS not being constrained by the regulatory approval process. So these were the 5 themes that we found in our qualitative analysis. Firstly, participants appreciated that open source APS gave them choice in terms of which products they use. For example, participants could choose to use insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors together, even if they were from different companies. Participants hoped that future commercial devices would also be as interoperable. The second feature was the user-led design. Participants appreciated that this technology was built by and for the diabetes community. Participants hoped that commercial companies could collaborate and learn from people in the open source community. Some even suggested that these companies should employ the people who had worked on the open source artificial pancreas systems, and that this would improve outcomes for everyone. The third feature was customizability. Participants were able to individualize their glucose targets, alarms, and apply settings for various circumstances as exercise. And they reported this was an improvement over their previous management, and it provided them with a sense of ownership. The lack of customizability in the currently commercially available devices was often cited as a major disadvantage. The fourth feature was the ability to evolve faster. This was in part due to not needing to wait for regulatory approval compared to commercial products. Participants felt that the commercial devices were primitive compared to the open source systems, and they could never catch up to the fast pace at which open source solutions were able to change and evolve. However, participants described that this enabled the open source community to play an important role in pushing for change to happen at a faster rate and for driving commercial companies to provide better solutions to people with diabetes. Finally, apart from the tangible benefits of the commercial systems, participants also appreciated being part of the peer support-driven community. Overall, participants believe that there was still a place for the open source APS community in the future of diabetes management, and they hope that it would grow in acceptance and popularity in the future. Commercial companies have the opportunity now to learn from the open source APS community. This includes learning which features they appreciate most, such as interoperability or customizability. Participants indicated that by working with, listening to, and learning from people with diabetes, commercial companies are much more likely to develop better products that will meet their needs, and doing so will create better technology for all. So today we talked about people's experiences and perspectives as open source APS. The research from the Open Project showed us that there's many reasons why someone may choose to use an open source APS, but the majority are doing so to improve their glucose levels and to reduce their risk of complications. We talked about some of the benefits and challenges and what strategies participants use to navigate these challenges. We discussed how using an open source APS does have some risks, but it also reduces the risks of their previous management. So overall, people still feel safer using one of these systems. And although participants in our study understood that health professionals could not endorse or provide specific advice on the open source artificial pancreas systems, ideally they wanted health professionals to be more knowledgeable and supportive. Finally, we talked about some perspectives on the future of artificial pancreas systems. Although participants believe that there'll be more commercial devices in the future, they felt that the open source community was here to stay. It's evident that this health technology is evolving rapidly, and that some people with diabetes are no longer relying on industry or health professionals to provide the solutions that they need. It's important for commercial companies to listen to what people with diabetes want and need, and for health professionals to continue to provide support and care to those who choose to use open source artificial pancreas systems, because people with diabetes are not waiting. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. I'd like to thank my co-authors for their work on both of these papers. I'd also like to thank the people of type 1 diabetes who volunteered their time and insights to this study. Without them, this research would not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. I forgot to introduce you, by the way, to mention that you are doing this as your PhD, that you're part of both Deakin and the University of Copenhagen. Is that right? Yep.
Yep, that's correct. I'm doing a joint degree there.
Cool. Thank you very much. That's great. So we're going to be joined now by the rest of the panel. So let me read the biography quickly from the invitation. So we're going to be joined by Jon Schull, who is a biological psychologist, inventor, entrepreneur, human-computer interaction researcher, and digital community organizer. Jon and I met again in the larger open source community when I was working for Helpful Engineering, because Jon is the creator of Enable, which is this amazing organization promoting and helping people print 3D print prosthetics, mostly for children. We're going to be joined by Anthony DiFranco, who is creator or co-creator of Open Insulin. And Jon is a member of several hackerspace in the Bay Area. And great guy all around that I met as well during my time with Helpful. So Renza, who's the author of the blog Diabetogenic, who lives with type 1 diabetes and who works for Diabetes Australia. And Dr. Densearn, who again I met at Helpful Engineering, where Densearn was a medical advisor for the board and chief medical officer. And Densearn practices in Australia, and amongst other responsibility, he has been a diabetes and female reproductive health fellow. So thank you very much for all the members of the panels, and thank you very much, Jasmine, for your time this morning. So I wanted to put this panel together, so across a little bit of the diabetes world, a little bit the medical world, and a lot the open source world, to discuss about these two questions that you put there, Jasmine. What can the rest of the ecosystem learn from this community? And hopefully, how all that could benefit other communities as well and other ecosystems. And I'm not sure who should I start for this question. Anthony, are you here?
Yes, I am. And
Great.
In fact, I would say that Open Insulin was much inspired by the DIY artificial pancreas work. And I myself was closely following that work. I actually have a background in control theory from school, and was playing around with some ideas, and I'd looked at the history of research on closed loop blood glucose control from a pretty well-informed perspective. So it's actually a bit strange to me that I ended up working on something else in the end, but a major motivation for Open Insulin, and for the particulars of how Open Insulin is structured, is to create a viable open source community around the stewardship of the technology that we need to make. And unlike in the case of closed loop blood glucose control, we're not really working a lot with electronics and software. We're working on kind of cooperative business plans and engineering microbes and things that require a bit more than just people with computers and some time. So we've ended up taking some of the lessons from there, but trying to generalize them to this new context. And so it's led to implementing a framework for collaboration among local organizations. We have a few hacker spaces that are participating in the project now, and created a foundation to steward the information associated with the technology, and the cooperative franchise framework that we're working on, that's patterned after the Wikimedia Foundation, and has a kind of federated structure. And in order to ensure that there's a condition similar to the one that exists in the case of the open source closed loop systems, where the people using those systems are prominent among those developing them, and vice versa. We've had to look at setting up institutions like that would create a similar condition for local production of pharmaceuticals. So that was a bit of a challenge initially to get our heads around, but in the end, it ended up being fairly straightforward. We ended up looking to co-ops. There's a pretty healthy history of cooperative organizations working in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. There have been buyers clubs. There have been cooperative insurance organizations, and there have been things like frameworks for cannabis cooperatives that once abstracted away from that particular product, provide a framework for thinking about how to produce and distribute a medicine in a local context, and in a way where the people using it are also the ones producing and distributing it. So we've ended up looking towards a lot of these other precedents to generalize what's going on in the DIY artificial pancreas world, and try to create a framework that can address a wider variety of needs in the same way and replicate some of the successful and helpful aspects of that.
Great. That's funny. You mentioned the insurance stuff. I took some notes, so probably something I would like to discuss more offline. That's a bit left field from this discussion. Renza, if I may drag you into this discussion, so access to insulin, access to technology, I imagine both of them are very important points into diabetes treatment. Is there any common challenges, some differences? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, access always is one of the biggest discussions in the diabetes community. And wearing my Diabetes Australia hat, it is certainly something that Diabetes Australia has been very active in lobbying. We're very fortunate in Australia that when it comes to insulin, we don't have the concerns that are seen elsewhere around the world. We don't have an insulin pricing crisis like there is in America. We don't have similar access issues that we see in under-resourced countries. In Australia, we know that every time we need to have an insulin prescription filled, it will be the PBS price. And often the most challenging, I guess, issue for us is that we have to call the pharmacy ahead of time, because often they might not have it in stock and they need to get it in. So access to insulin, certainly in Australia, isn't one of the issues, but that's not to say that people in Australia are not very conscious of what's going on elsewhere in the world, and looking at how to certainly amplify the need to have insulin. I mean, when we break it all down, we can look at technologies and talk about how we think everybody should have a CGM or whatever it might be. But if you're living with type 1 diabetes or insulin requiring type 2 diabetes, this is the non-negotiable that we have to start with, and that is being able to get people insulin. When it comes to technologies, of course, access is an issue everywhere around the world in different ways. And, when I talk technology, I'm talking from an insulin syringe or pen, a blood glucose monitor, right through to a hybrid closed loop system, and everything beyond. In Australia, again, and this is where I am, and this is the playground that I generally play in, and the work that I do. We have great access through the NDSS for blood glucose monitoring and blood glucose monitoring strips, for syringes, for needles, and for insulin pump consumables. We don't have quite as good access to CGM because there is an eligibility criteria that covers probably about 50% of people with type 1 diabetes, that it leaves 50% of the community still out there needing to be able to access and to pay for their own. And I think that that's part of the reason why we're looking at how, turning to the community, and why the community looking at solutions is really important. So we've seen some brilliant innovations from the community with working out how to extend transmitters on CGMs that have a factory setting of 3 months, and after that they don't work anymore, even though they're perfectly still good to keep going. But and so there have been community initiatives to work out how to extend that. People will extend sensors. You know, it is the people who are directly affected. You know, I use the term skin in the game, and I mean it literally here. We are wearing these devices on our skin. You know, we really are trying to find a way to increase access, to increase affordability, to make things simpler. You know, when people ask me what the holy grail of diabetes is, obviously it's a cure. We keep getting promised that that's happening in 5 years, but that 5-year needle seems to keep being moved. So in lieu of that, it's doing less with diabetes. And it seems to be, it's people in the diabetes community who are the ones who are making that happen. And that, I think, is incredible. It's exciting. It's also not surprising, though, I think.
Thank you very much, Renza. Very educative and inspiring to imagine having always to worry about that. The access is something. Densearn, in your practice, is this something that you have encountered? Open source technology, looping, or otherwise? Is it something you have already encountered clinically?
Yeah, I must say, thanks for having me here, by the way. Thanks for the introduction, and I think great presentation from the start, Jasmine. Look, I think what Renza mentioned resonates very well with me. Essentially, the team that we have to approach for in diabetic management is simplicity is key from a consumer's perspective, from a patient's perspective. The thing here is, to answer your question, Pierre, is it common for me to encounter this? Yes and no. It's common in the sense that it's always raised in discussions. Is there something that is that I could recommend? I mean, from an ethical legal obligation, I guess I would say, you know, there are evidence out there, and I can direct them to the evidence. But as a clinician, especially in the public sector, I mean, you're definitely not supposed to at least say, you know, use this against that, for example. That's number one. And then in that case, if you sort of leave the evidence, you know, that you kindly provide to your patients, they're sort of left stranded. You know, how do I decide? I've already got these overwhelming things to do, you know, in my life, and then I've got to manage my own thing. And then now I've got to read a scientific paper. I mean, you can't expect patients to do so, and then, you know, understand what to do from there. Now, what about those who already have something, and then they ask you, are they on the right track? That's another thing as well. I mean, all we can do is support them and just try to prevent some of the acute complications, such as, you know, severe hypoglycemia or very low sugars, for example. Bearing in mind that all these models out there are continuously learning, I would have thought, and it's adapted to suit a person. And back to the point, in terms of continuous glucose monitoring, just take the whole artificial pancreas system out of the picture, just utilization of the continuous glucose monitoring. And yes, I agree that in Australia, we're fortunate that we have some subsidies for this, but the subsidies sort of stop in general for a lot of these people once they're above 21 years of age. So you sort of have great control for the first few years of their life, bearing in mind that, you know, the first part of their life for all these type 1s are, you know, in their very inquisitive and active phase where they're rebellious as well. They're probably not having great control for the first 10 years. You have relatively decent control in the next 10 years with just the continuous glucose monitoring. And then the government sort of stops that subsidy, and then they're left stranded for the rest of their lives. And the healthcare cost burden sort of shoots up further, and that's where it comes anyway, because most of the complications, if you take type 2 diabetes, for example, sort of comes a bit later, you know, in their 40s, 50s, when they have more disease burden and they have things like cardiovascular complications. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to type 1 diabetes, all these complications will be accelerated. So we have data to sort of support the numbers, in this case, for example, in terms of the distinguishing factors between type 1 and type 2 in cardiovascular. We do have such numbers. Will it change if we publish such numbers? Yes and no, I guess. The main bit that I do in my practice, though, in terms of trying to pivot a change for clinicians to adopt such technology, well, firstly, I think there's a lot of monopoly in this game. And I find that rightfully so, I do tend to agree that if there is some sort of monopoly from a commercial standpoint, it is largely for a better model, predictive model, and it's the wealth or big data management and warehousing and governance of that data in a private, in some sort of, I guess, better structured data governance policy. Now, what's the worst that could happen if such data is leaked out about glucose and insulin monitoring? I guess on a consumer level, that leakage wouldn't lead to necessarily any harm to the consumer. Will it lead to any harm to others? Not really. But from a commercial company standpoint, that leakage of whatever bit of information there could be their source of revenue anyway. Would they want that to be leaked? Probably not. So hence why the cost burden sort of falls back to consumers. For example, I guess the commercially available thing like MiniMed, for example, Medtronic in Australia. I think they've got newer models, I think from 670s, now 770 and 780. It is all going through FDA anyway. So my approach to my clinical practice, and this is solely my approach anyway, I would say, and it's something that I've been trying to encourage. And I think I'm still buzzing. I think Pierre would have could attest to this. We were at the Australian Healthcare Week a few weeks ago. I think Simon was there as well. And certainly I'm still buzzing from that because I was on two panels there, one for consumer and patient engagement and the other side for clinician adoption in startups. So firstly, I would say, would there be a feasibility for a startup to sort of bring this about? Although I'm trying to bring a lot of clinicians into the startup world to help with health tech and help reduce disease burden, especially in non-communicable diseases. The answer to this is yes and no again. Why? Clinicians are a very, very, and I use clinicians very broadly because it doesn't just encompass doctors in diabetes care. I think I would say the best person for ongoing diabetic management are the diabetes educators or clinical diabetes or credentialed diabetes educators. There are nurse practitioners as well out there, and these are probably the best tool out there for patients living with diabetes. Largely because if I were to just pick a subset of doctors, for example, time is of essence for them. Nothing against them. Everyone's got a family, I guess, as well, and other practices. But the adoption of technology amongst clinicians, especially doctors, are generally poor. Take electronic medical records, for example. I mean, in the public sector, you're sort of enforced if you're working in public. But if you're in a private sector, you can opt out anyway. You can choose not to. And most of the private sectors I know would have very limited electronic medical record adoption. The only adoption is probably in terms of pathology and in terms of drug charting and drug management to reduce error. But on day-to-day writing of notes, would they want to do it? Would they want to learn more of this? Probably not. And I can tell you, it's all hand. In a private sector, private hospitals, for example, it's still paper-based notes. So just going by that mentality in general, it's very difficult to have clinicians, especially doctors, to sort of be the person to advocate for this. And then you're sort of left with the other subset of clinicians, which I've mentioned, and of course, patient advocate agencies, and of course, things like in Australia, it'll be Diabetes Australia as well. And the experts that sort of consult for all this in general are people who hold PhDs, professors, and the adoption of technology in general, nothing against these people, but there is a term that we use in the health tech space or digital health space called the fallacy of professors. Professors in general are great. They're experts, but in the digital tech world, in the digital health world, many of them have not practiced using technology back in their prime time of clinical practice. They are learning about such technologies and they are supervising, they are PhD students on such technologies. And we are seeing more and more of these younger, early career researchers out there who are pivoting a change for adoption. But of course, the voice by them as compared to a voice with someone who's been in the game for long is very different. And the other bit that I would say is, I think someone touched on this earlier, is reimbursement models, I guess. It's very, very hard to get anywhere in diabetes care without reimbursement models. And I think I sort of touched on this earlier when, we sort of talk about just purely continuous glucose monitoring, whereby the subsidies sort of stop for most of this when they're at 21. So on a personal level, I'll probably end of this. I think I've taken up too much time, but what I'll end is in terms of how I would like to approach this is I like to sort of do it in a more niche subpopulation. For example, type 1 who are pregnant, and that's the space that I've been sort of working at anyway, maternal health or remote monitoring. Because I think there is a tendency for a number of us to over-medicalize pregnancy a bit too much. It's important to monitor them, but it's not important or essential for them to come every couple of weeks to the hospital, for example. But that changes once they're labeled, not even type 1, but as soon as they're labeled as gestational diabetes, a mother has to come quite often, largely for us. And, just thinking about the waiting period in the waiting room, for example, it could be up to 3 hours for us to just spend 5 minutes in their glucose diary. Some of these could be done remotely, certainly. We're doing it by phone call these days since the era of the COVID. But I think even prior to that, many of us have already sort of pitched or pivoted sort of just a little sort of glucose-based monitoring platform that goes beyond just an app. But an app for a glucose diary is very essential, and that could be good stuff for just pure gestational diabetes. But if we have such system out there that has a loop for type 1, which is reimbursed by at least in Australia, it's reimbursed anyway. If you're a type 1 who is pregnant or wanting to get pregnant, the continuous glucose monitoring is already reimbursed. I think there are research out there that are trying to learn such models. But I think the fact of the matter is, once we start implementing such technology in such subpopulation, I think the assumption has to be that they are coming in to this pregnancy in a relatively well-controlled glycemic control, and many of them are not. So if you have a pregnancy that lasts for about 9 months in general, but they come to a clinician probably for the last 7 months, you have 7 months to play around to learn of a model that suits a patient who may be coming into a pregnancy poorly controlled to begin with. And that 7 months is a very, very limited time frame to learn and also relearn and retest that model. So I'm still learning what's the best in terms of pivoting a change and adoption here at a reimbursable level that's digestible to all clinicians and consumers alike. And I'm open to listening to more suggestions here. And I'm keen to get some feedback about what I've just gone through, actually. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Densearn. Very extensive response. Thank you to your, the clinical side is fundamental, of course. I'm gonna go to Jon now to talk about communities, because Jon, I know you have been involved for a very long time now into creating, managing, animating communities. How does that inspire you? Or is it something you were well aware of already, the looping? You're muted, Jon.
When I was reading about the Enable community, I noticed some similarities between Enable and the DIY APS community in terms of, that concept of like, if this can work for me or work for one child, it could work for thousands, and the similarities in terms of, volunteers who are teaching people how to build these systems.
Right. I trust you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now, Jon.
Okay. Sorry, I have an echo, but I think I fixed it. No, I haven't. Give me 1 second.
On our side, it sounds okay.
I mean, we can all hear you, I think.
Well, that's great, but okay, now it's okay. Okay, great. Because I was driving myself crazy with my own voice as an echo. So yes, Enable, we have a similar life history to the OpenAPS system. Both started roughly 10 years ago as sort of a hacker who said, there's got to be a better way. And they came up with what seemed to be a better way. And it became a community and a movement. And I would say that our scope is comparable. Some thousands of users in a world in which there are millions of people who would benefit from better systems. And in listening to this presentation and to listening to Dr. Scibilia, I realized the vast gap between the hackers who say there must be a better way and we think we can do this, and the professionals who are embedded within a really complex and difficult and high-priced, whether consumers paying the system, paying the bill or not, economically intensive system. It's a very big gap. And my first reaction is that the patients, the users, the humans are not being well served by either extreme or by the gray zone that some of us are in, right? There are still too many people who can't get the affordable care. There are people who are willing to participate in these hackish experiments by groups like Enable, no offense, but perhaps also OpenAPS. And there are also many of them who are not being served by the medical community, which provides limited coverage or restrictive care, or just doesn't have solutions that really meet their needs, which is especially frustrating because you can see from the innovation that it ought to be possible to give them better solutions. I think that's the important lesson, is that I don't think Enable has demonstrated that everyone could have a good prosthetic if they just did what we do. We haven't reached enough people, our devices are not good enough, they fail, etc. I don't know about the situation for OpenAPS, but seems to me you have to be very brave to be experimenting with one of these systems on your own body, because those, there are potential fatalities or serious consequences if something goes wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't put the people who have that bravery in that position. I think they're providing a really important service, but this isn't the way it should be. So the first thing I want to offer is a social critique. The system within which the hackers are struggling and the clinicians are struggling is not well designed. It seems to me it seems to have evolved to serve. This is actually, it has evolved in response to the activities of the incumbents who become set in their ways. They end up protecting what they have been trained to do. They are overworked and often underpaid, and so they don't have time to learn new techniques or new technologies. And meanwhile, the companies that are making serious money have no real interest in undermining their own established channels that in many cases they've made complicated in order to protect their incumbency. I mean, that's not a sophisticated or highly knowledgeable critique, but I've been around the block often enough that I'm willing to offer it as a conjecture about what's wrong here. I'll pause if anyone wants to disagree, because I came on fairly strong, but it turns out I have a strong view about this. Any comments on that?
I think Anthony has said in the chat he has some comments.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I can't disagree. I just wanted to speak to that from the perspective of actually looking at the practical aspects of getting insulin made and distributed. And it also relates to something that came up previously about how, this is again a little bit more concrete instance of what you've been talking about over the last few minutes, which is if you're thinking about getting the payment system behind whatever you're developing, that is in itself a really daunting problem. And I want to mention that in open insulin, we found that the actual cost of making and distributing insulin at a small scale would be around, by our initial estimate, $7 a vial. So, that is at a point where, even someone who uses a fairly large amount of insulin would be paying less than or about as much as a typical copay for an insured person in the United States. The broader point is, I think we've seen some empirical evidence in this of what you're talking about how all of this complexity in the supply chain that exists now, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, I would say, the vast majority of it exists to create barriers to new interests and to protect incumbent interests. And, what we've seen in the example of making insulin is that, you don't really need anything to reach the same cost to the end user of the insulin that, these tremendously complex and corrupt supply chains that go from the manufacturers through the pharmacy benefits managers and the insurance companies and the pharmacies all the way, eventually to the person who's actually using the insulin, that they didn't add value, they took away a tremendous amount of value. And, when the value is somewhat, bearing on, people's health and lives, they've also taken away a lot of people's health and cost people their lives. And, that also relates to some broader, criticisms of just oligopoly capitalism in general. But I think we have a really, urgent example of it here that you can really dig in concretely into a bunch of these, aspects of how it operates in the particular situations that it operates.
Yeah, I think that's right, Anthony. You'll notice I managed not to use the word corrupt, and I'm not sure that's the right interpretation, but we're on the same page here. It's listen, we're at a time in human history when we're seeing lots of systems that seem to be failing. And you can blame greedy people, or you can blame incompetence, or you can blame overpopulation, but in some ways, I think that's besides the point. So let me move on to a second point, and then I will claim to have done my job as a panelist. The second point is the one thing the incumbent system does is it produces standardized practices and products. I'm sort of trying to creep on the whole issue of quality control. There's a certain number of products. They've all gone through rigorous testing. You can actually assume that every vial you open from a particular manufacturer, or every hypodermic syringe that you open from a package is going to be like every other one of its kind. That whole standardization is one thing that comes from the system. And let's face it, it's really relevant, not just when you're putting devices on your hand, but for example, injecting substances into your body. So I do want to acknowledge that that is one of the rationales for the existing system, and it's an important function which my community has not mastered yet. We do not have good quality control, and that's A, because it's hard, and it's B, because we're in no position to impose regulations on a volunteer hacker community. So that, on the one hand, that's meant to temper my social critique, but on the other hand, suggests that if we want this to go forward, we are going to have to figure out how to provide quality assurance and quality assurance, regularity within this context, because I do have one small third point I want to make, which is that, you know, I'm thinking about the environmental crisis right now. And again, people are slow to adopt new solutions, even when they see that their entire existence is imperiled. So it's not just professionals who've got a lot on their mind and are not quick to change their ways. Change is genuinely hard, except we're all here using Zoom. This is my 5th Zoom meeting of the day. I had one a week before the pandemic. I exaggerate, but my point is change can happen. And we saw with Zoom, and we have seen with OpenAPS, and we've seen with Enable, that actually the established system is not that good at shutting us down. Change can happen. And so my point is that I think if we want to go beyond the disruptive storytelling role that we have, we really have to invent a system that more and more people can adopt without being quite as courageous or as risk tolerant as we thought. And we need to figure out what kinds of replicable processes, including commercial processes, because people have to make a living, can adopt the innovations which are available for free in today's world. But the whole, what they call in the tech world, tech transfer, open source tech transfer into mass adoption, I'm beginning to think it ain't going to happen because of big business. And so it's going to happen because we decide, we find people who are able to work with us to make that happen. That's what I got.
Thank you very much, Jon. Quite passionate panel contribution. Thank you. I'd like to dial back a little bit on the access and politics and opposition towards commercial innovators. Don't want to create opposition or thing. I want to come back to something Densearn said, and after that we're probably going to open the floor to audience question. The access to evidence. Densearn, you mentioned that your role as a doctor is to point your patient toward available evidence for them to make them the informed decision of what's best for themselves. I think that personally, and that would be my panel contribution, I think that some things the open source communities need to improve. And I'm really thankful again to Jasmine, because that's what's happening now. And like I was saying, Jon, the change, we can change. We don't have to complain about establishment or whatever preventing the change from happening. We just have to make it happen. And that's what Jasmine is doing with her research, to really bridge the gap between industry-sponsored clinical research and makerspace, benchtop kind of innovation. We need communities to work together to produce evidence with the same level of quality than the commercial solution. And that's when my, I can't remember, nemesis, the regulators comes in, is that the thing, no, I'm working with regulation daily. That's what I do for a living. I help entrepreneurs go through regulation. And I have really a love-hate relationships with regulation, because there are amazing people writing amazing standards that are very powerful. I mean, the risk management standards are very solid. There's a lot of technical standards that are really helping people build solid technology. But the whole ecosystem of standard and regulation is extremely paternalistic. And that's something that I've heard a lot. I see that David Barin from Bionic Wookie is here, and David, you'll have time to speak and to ask questions and to contribute, I'm sure. So last time I saw you speaking about this, you say that I don't want to be regulated by the TGA as an individual. And putting that to the level of the evidence, my point of view on the regulatory ecosystem is very paternalistic in the sense that the TGA or the FDA will tell you, you don't need to look at the evidence. We did, and we gave the stamp to the manufacturer. But to me, that's not how science works. And that's not how self-managed disease can work. And people with type 1 diabetes will tell, that's what David was, I'm paraphrasing what I heard him saying. I manage my diabetes and I want my doctor to mentor me, to consult with me. They are not managing, I am. And the attitude of the regulators that say, we manage the safety of the technology and we gave you a stamp, to me, the pandemic has shown us the limit of that with the vaccine. People don't trust the regulators anymore to tell them, yeah, the vaccines are safe. No, and safe doesn't mean anything. Safe is not the threshold that you are above. For every individual person, the threshold between safety and effectiveness and risk and benefits and all that, it's unique to every single person. And I'm not saying from tomorrow we all go up and we all be able to make wise safety and benefit decision. Of course, we will still need institutions to help us put that together. But the key to be able whatsoever to get there one day is access to evidence. So that's why my contribution to, and my advice to open source communities at wide is learn the rope of writing good documentation, of writing good evidence, and of community, reach out to clinicians, reach out to researchers, reach out to people who know how to do those things so that they can help you do it, or you can give them the technology for them to do it and find new models to do it, to empower patients and doctors to make the right decision by having access to evidence and access to documentation.
Can I just jump in? Because I think there are a couple of things in there that I'd like to unpick a little bit. I think the first point I want to make is that I think that one of the real challenges that I personally and a lot of other people, from what I'm hearing, have with regulators is beyond that. It's also that the regulators decide what are the metrics that make something worth using or approved. And they're not always the same metrics that people living with diabetes might actually consider to be the most critical. So also, this medication or this device or this whatever, this intervention, this therapy reduces HbA1c. Awesome, that's great. Except my HbA1c has been in range for the last however long. It's not the most important thing to me. The things that are important to me are things like I can check my glucose on my watch. I can dial my insulin from my watch. That means that suddenly diabetes doesn't become the focus when I'm sitting at a table with people or in an office with people. It means that I get more sleep. I sleep better, I function better, I can play with my kid better, all of those sorts of things. And yet they are not necessarily, and I know that bits and pieces we are absolutely seeing that these are becoming more and more things that are considered, but not enough when it comes to what regulators consider important. And I think that that goes to your point about what sorry, I'm hearing an echo. I'm not sure if anyone else is, it might just be me, but I think that does go to your point that we, need to broaden what that research looks like. It doesn't have to be just a randomized controlled trial anymore. There are other ways that we can look at developing evidence that will support better outcomes for people. And I think that that's really, really critical, because when I look at the benefits that I have from using a DIY system, absolutely, my A1C is lower than it was, but it actually wasn't all that high before. But it's the fact that diabetes intrudes far less into my life. It means that I get more time to not think diabetes. It means that there are fewer, I have fewer hypos, all of those sorts of things that actually really impact my quality of life. That's the measurement that I walk away with at the end of the day as being critically important. But I just also want to point, and I think it was raised in here about the issue of safety. Safety is never ever far from the minds of a person with diabetes, ever. You know, we're diagnosed with this condition. We're given usually an insulin pen or a syringe and an insulin, and we're sent on our merry way. Insulin is a dangerous drug. It can be a lethal drug dosed with just a tiny error. Safety is everything to us, every minute of every day. And I find that that's, I think that Jasmine shared one of Dana's things about here, but I know that when I first started talking about DIY APS to health professionals, every single time somebody from industry would get up and say, yeah, but ours is safe. And I thought, how dare you suggest for 1 second that I'm doing something reckless or unsafe? Or how dare you suggest that a parent is doing something reckless and unsafe to their kid with diabetes? That's the paradigm that we need to change. I think we're making a little bit of a move there because I don't know, maybe I've just scared people and they're just not saying it to me anymore. But I think that certainly is, you know, we're making steps in the right direction. And the final point that I just want to raise is I do agree with that comment about the paternalism in healthcare. I have the most wonderful non or unpaternalistic endocrinologist. I've been seeing the poor woman for 20 years. She can't get rid of me. She's not allowed to retire until there's a cure for diabetes. She's brilliant. But every single piece of diabetes technology, every single time I've wanted to try a new insulin, every time I've wanted to try a new therapy, I've gone to her and asked. I'm not sitting here, that we are not waiting goes beyond what's going on in technology. I'm not waiting for a health professional to tell me what I should be doing. I'm very conscious that there is a very wide spectrum of what people living with diabetes and other healthcare conditions, the way that they interact with their healthcare professionals, the way they want to be treated by their healthcare professionals, the way that they want to either direct or be directed to do things. I completely understand that. But again, that paternalism in healthcare, it rings through constantly when we have this idea that we are passively waiting to be handed a treatment option, because I know certainly that that's not the way that most of the diabetes advocates that I am fortunate enough to engage with here and around the world, that's just certainly not the way that they think. I might be quiet now.
Awesome, Renza, thank you very much. Now, looking at the relatively low number of the audience, I think maybe it's ridiculous to do breakout rooms. And I'm thinking it's simpler if anyone wants to ask questions, not to try to jump at the same time, and we should be able to manage all in the same room, don't you think? Cool. So go ahead, shoot.
Pierre and Renza, I might just throw in there the view from a regulator's perspective, because I've sat on the other end. I've sat in a pharmaceutical company and seen when we got stick because medical professionals stuffed it up. And when medical professionals stuffed it up, the blame actually landed on the regulator. So the regulators have got all to lose and nothing to win by getting something out that's slightly dangerous. So they're super risk averse, which probably steps that paternalistic nature. So I can kind of feel where they're coming from. I agree with you entirely. But and you know, there was a lot that was said to step change and levels of safety for certain to get past the regulatory hurdle, and maybe that step needs to be lower in certain areas where there is really good control. But it's an open question, and it's a hard one for regulators to get through, because they know they're going to cop a lot of blame if it goes wrong.
That's a good point. Although that's a double-edged sword. This same paternalistic stance of the regulator, for instance, I'm pretty sure for the vaccine, again, the approval came with a blanket protection for the vaccine manufacturers that now no one can sue them anymore. There's more than a few anecdotal reports of people having bad vaccine reaction. That was expected. There's no serious information that I could find on how much exactly, because no one is willing to pursue this research, because the manufacturers have been given blanket protection that now they are approved. The decision has been made. Vaccines are safe. We can't have an adult scientific, rational discussion as a society about the safety of medical technology with this sort of approach. Approval means we can't critique anymore. It's safe.
That's actually a really good point, Pierre, because one of the most dangerous drugs that's out there is aspirin. So if you try and pull aspirin from the market, what sort of consumer backlash do you reckon you're going to get? Right. Maybe Densearn, you can jump in on that one.
I might just jump in here if you don't mind. Just wanted to quickly draw a significant distinguishing factor when it comes to regulation. What we are used to, actually all of us, including, I guess, consumers out there, is our knowledge or prior knowledge on regulation of medical devices, not as a software, but medical devices or drugs in general. These are all the conventional things. Even TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Administration here, there's an ever-changing model when it comes to evaluating software as medical device. Buzzword there is SAMD. And the fact of the matter is, no one knows what is the best thing out there at this very moment. And it's still an ever-changing process. And the processes from a regulatory standpoint, if you're sitting in their camp, is going to be even harder. Largely being because any whiff of a potential risk, they will shut it down first, but they will not provide you ways of how to overcome that. I mean, that's the person submitting the application's job. So whoever is submitting that, I mean, if the regulatory advisors out there can advise them a bit better prior to submission, again, you still have to, pivot it to this panel of, some could be clinicians, some would not be clinicians, but there will be a panel who will judge and evaluate it. And again, any one of the panel members in there will get a whiff of anything. It could be a small thing like, do we have any sufficient information? For example, if we talk about open use here, when it comes to a software for insulin management in a closed loop. Firstly, from a medical advice standpoint, an insulin pump is a class 3 anyway. So that's at the highest scrutiny already. And then you couple it with a software that will tweak it a bit further. The intensity of that scrutiny is going to be even higher. So any whiff of, if you don't submit enough data of, what's the risk of hypoglycemia, for example, although hypoglycemia doesn't mean that you're going to pass out right away, but any whiff of 0.1, if they said, we don't have enough data there, we can't justify supporting this. And I would agree from a regulatory standpoint, because from a person living with diabetes who's seeking help using open source technology, now those are very rare, firstly. People living with diabetes is a very chronic disease. It's a chronic disease. And there's a subpopulation who are averse to help, who do not seek help. And the disease burden that you quote in a lot of journal articles out there, or in the introduction for any journal articles, all that disease burden there is actually numbers that are from people who are seeking help or not enough help or don't seek help at all. Those numbers quoted there is not quite the same as what we see amongst people who are championing such technology currently. So for example, if I give you a standard clinic scenario for a diabetic clinic in a public setting, a lot of them are failed to attend attendees who finally have to come in because, for example, they are diabetic and they are truck drivers who need a doctor's certificate to provide them with another source of income for the next 12 months. Are they good in their diabetes control? Not at all. But they need to see a doctor to actually extend that. So will there be the good sort of figures to recruit for your study? For example, if you want to, collate numbers, numbers in a public setting, to pivot it to the regulators to say that, yeah, public level that, we've got enough data and evidence that it helps. Well, you won't be able to get those numbers. So I can understand from a researcher standpoint, ethics committee when you submit such a proposal, well, you can't. I mean, it's very hard. And if you think about it, any adoption of such software, if this person is driving a school bus right next to your kid, you would say no, would you? Just purely, you would say, oh, gee, I would say no. They shouldn't be allowed to drive, test this technology, and then we go about it. But if you think about it, you take the object out of the picture, and we think about all of this being someone who just do a lot of sports, for example. They could be running next to you. I mean, is that any safer? I mean, they could be running and just dropping, from hypoglycemia because overexertion that consumes more sugar with an unregulated technology. And it could be, that person who has amazing glycemic control driving that bus could be running that guy over. So again, from a regulatory standpoint, you'd be thinking, oh, gee, there's a lot of risk here. I would want this to be monitored further. But I think if I were to sit on the regulator standpoint, how do I provide you evidence, provide you with advice to collect better information for mass adoption? I wouldn't know how to give you that answer, to be honest. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very, very difficult, especially in something like that, because as Renza pointed out, glycemic control is one thing, but glycemic control adopted to that person on an individual level, for example, sometimes a person living with diabetes, all they want is to have enough energy levels to last through the next meal, for example. So I've got a HbA1c of 4.9% or 5%. I mean, that's great. But with this monitoring and the software, can it give me that energy level that I want? And again, that software can't predict what activity levels I'm going to have in the next half an hour. For example, if I decide to have this wacky idea of running up the stairs, is it safe enough? Can it adapt in that thing with that exertion? So there's a lot of nuances there, and I can understand why adoption of such things at this point in time, when it comes to software as a medical device, when it comes to chronic disease, such as something where most people think it's just a numbers game, is very difficult, because it is not just a numbers game.
Well, I think we.
Go ahead, Jasmine. Go ahead.
And I might just add one last bit. For example, you won't be seeing something like a implantable cardiac defibrillator, for example, and then giving that sort of feedback back to the consumers, for example, because it leads straight to death. So for something like that. So why are we scrutinizing diabetes, for example? Because why are we feeding it back to the consumers? Why? Because for years we've empowered patients to manage themselves. I mean, that's the best way to manage diabetes. But from a majority of the early, I guess, consumers or patients out there who have diabetes, most, I can tell you right now, would say they think it's just a numbers game, until they get that idea that this is more than a numbers game. This is more than that and beyond. And then they realize they have an ever-changing activity level. That's when they start realizing that diabetes is much more than that. So I'll probably leave at that, because I think I've said too much, I think. But just with the implantable cardiac defibrillators, for example, you will never give that data back to a consumer. Why? Because they can't interpret it. But with diabetes, they can interpret those numbers, and we are empowering them to somewhat be clinicians for themselves sometimes. And is that a fair call? But that's what we've been doing all this while. But when it comes to a closed loop system, though, we are taking that control to a certain extent. And from a regulatory standpoint, how long is one individual going to stay out of that control versus another is very hard to say. But I agree, you can always overrule it because you're human, right? And you can always administer whatever is necessary to take over control. But I think a lot of things that the regulators think about, and a lot of things that they cannot predict, that unfortunately extends to consumers not being able to get something that they may need, or especially a large proportion who are really wanting a change in their lifestyle and health.
So I think one thing I wanted to mention is that I just wanted to show that we're using respectful language towards people with diabetes in this call and speaking about, I think we talked about some of the hypothetical situations there around driving, for example, that I'm not sure were entirely accurate. And then we're talking about control, giving over control to this device, or, the device not being able to respond to exercise. But when it comes to these open source devices, people are able to still have control. They are able to customize that. They are able to have settings for exercise. They're able to predict those things and have settings for those things. And I think David wanted to say something on that because I saw you react to the control comment.
Yeah, this sort of comes down to the issue of it being a chronic disease. So I'm not every person with diabetes, but for me, living with a chronic disease means that I am managing it every day. I'm living with it all the time, and I consult with the doctor every now and then. This is quite different to
David, you've got yourself on mute. That was clever.
I didn't touch anything. Where did I get up to?
I did it by accident. You were saying, anyway, I apologize for disrupting.
Okay.
Every day, you were saying you manage.
Oh yeah, I do this every day. This is quite different from the relationship with a traditional relationship with the doctor for acute conditions, where people go to the doctor and they want to get treated and they want to get fixed and go home. And I see this in the support communities we have, especially for type 2 diabetes. People have this thing thrust upon them, and it's a big mind shift to come to terms with the fact that this is something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life, and you're in control of it. Now, for a lot of people with diabetes, they do leave a lot of control up to the doctors. So not everyone is like me, but I'm one of the people living with it and I've been dosing insulin for almost 40 years now, making all these decisions every day. So when I go for exercise, I'm always thinking, do I have enough food in the system? All this other stuff going on. So if something goes wonky and I get hypo during exercise, then in my head, that's all right, I need to do something different. I try not to blame myself for stuff, but that's another issue. The automated closed loop systems are not a black box that we just plug in and expect it to just be an artificial pancreas. In fact, the term artificial pancreas is really misleading. What we are using is an automated insulin delivery system. It's a tool that assists us. It makes lots of moment-to-moment decisions for us, so we don't have to keep watching. I can look at the system every now and then and say, oh, yep, it's doing fine. Oh no, I need to tweak something. So giving up control, at least for me and for many people I know, is we're getting another tool for control. So that perspective may change things. I think some other people had their hands up.
I had my hand up. I just want to share half a thought in case this group wants to go somewhere with it in the future. Which is just that it might be interesting to find a model system. Maybe it's insulin pumps, but for all the reasons we've talked about, the stakes are so high there, and it's such a complicated system that may not be good. It could be that prosthetic hands are the right thing. It could be that bicycles are the right thing. The right thing I'm pointing to is, wouldn't it be nice if we had a test bed for developing an open source community that did quality control, that went through, that proved that it could achieve some level of replicability and reliability in order to establish methodologies and processes before we say we're ready to rework the medical system. That's all I got, but it seems to me that may be something that we need and could find is a system in which we could work through the experiment, really as an experiment, in order to say, look, this is now a proven viable model. Let's now apply it to a more controversial area with a little bit more confidence.
One of the assumptions that I sort of feel is being made a little bit here is that open source solutions or therapies or devices, systems, whatever, are more dangerous to the user. And, you know, my N=1 experiment that I've been now doing for 4.5 years, but again, I know hundreds of people who are using this, will repeatedly say that, yes, their diabetes management is better, but what that means is that they are safer. So when I have a, you know, when I'm not being good at diabetes, which I regularly say I'm not good at diabetes. So when I'm having a day where my glucose levels are all over the shop or where I've had a hypo or whatever, it's because I thought I was smarter than the loop system I'm using and I overrode what it told me to do. So the errors are human here. This loop is far, far smarter than I ever could be. I used to be really, really good at maths. I do calculus problems just for fun because, hey, I've got a spare 10 minutes. But my loop is way smarter than me. And you know what else? Doesn't get tired, doesn't get distracted, doesn't get caught up on Twitter in an argument with somebody about politics. It keeps going throughout all of that. And that is quite amazing, really. So when I think about what life with diabetes was like prior to using a DIY system to now, it is significantly different. Significantly different. I think that that's, you know, so some of the assumptions that we have is that this is more dangerous. It's actually, for so many people, safer. You know, every time I look at my Dexcom clarity readout and there's a thing about chance of something, you know, I can't remember what the language on it is, but it's something, you know, chance of a hypo or something is really low every single time. I used to have hypos all the time. And it wasn't because I was being a bad diabetic, to use language that I would never use. It was because I was living with diabetes. I've got something now that fixes a lot of the mistakes that I used to make. And also, I just want to thank Jasmine for raising the issue about being cautious of language. But one of the points I just want to make, I have never been empowered to do something. It's not like somebody has activated that empowerment. And so I think that when we talk about empower, you know, we've given people the space to be empowered or whatever, it is again suggesting that we are waiting for that to happen instead of actually us driving what it is that we're doing. And again, I acknowledge that spectrum because I have people saying to me, you know, I really like going to the doctor a few times a year and then telling me what to do and then I just do it. And I say, great, if that works for you, that is absolutely awesome. There are absolutely people who prefer that. But those of us who are perhaps more agenda setters and more proactive in you know, doing things the way that we want to do them, it's not because somebody waved a wand over me and said, I'm giving you the right to do this. It was because there was no other way to be, to ensure that I knew that I was getting what was right for me at that time. And that changes constantly. You know, it'd be so much easier if we just kind of grabbed something and went, yep, that's how it's going to be forever for the rest of my life with diabetes. But diabetes changes frequently, and so does the way that we choose to manage it.
I was just going to comment there about Jon was talking about finding another model somewhere where some of these processes could be put together. And I'm reminded of the analogy with driving. So cruise control, lane assist, all of these tools help keep me in the lane. The step of giving up complete control to a self-driving car is not what we're talking about here. But that is something that a lot of companies have spent a lot of money on and regulators are very concerned about. They're less concerned about the lane assist and all those other such tools, although there are still concerns. I'm not suggesting that anyone suddenly set up in the auto business.
the parallel is interesting, David, because I remember seeing a video from, I can't remember the name of the guy, but I'll put it in the document after the fact. He was the first guy who actually jailbreaks the iPhone. You know, he's really big brains. And he demonstrated very easily that actually any car marketed in the US after 2012, you can use the port under the wheel, under the driving wheel. The diagnostic ports actually can send driving command to the car. And any car past 2012, you can connect a phone and some magic hardware to make it a self-driving car. And he demonstrated with a few journalists in the car with just a couple of cell phone, open source, self-driving car. I think it's a Honda Accord or something like that. So there's this same aspect of business wanting, you know, initially business are against regulation when you are an innovator, when you're a new business, when you're a startup, because it's complicated, it's expensive, it's hard to understand. But once you're in and once you have gone through regulation, regulation becomes your friend because they are the barrier to entry for your competition. And that this whole hypocrisy of this system of regulation should be just to protect the public. And even when I say to protect, not to protect in the paternalistic sense of, okay, I protect you from all bad technology, but to protect you from malicious actors and false information and this sort of thing. That should just be that. It shouldn't be to create literally the condition of unfair competition, because that's sometimes what regulations are doing, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree with that point there, Pierre. I think from my involvement in startups, I see that a lot. I think sometimes there tends to be this thing from the regulatory end that there is the necessity for them to look at so many different aspects to such a scrutiny that they forget the whole purpose, that whatever the other party that's submitting this application is trying to create is to reduce, and they have looked at some of these issues already. And why, for example, from a regulatory standpoint, the people who are judging that panel, some of them may not even be people living with diabetes. How can that be fair? That is unfair. I mean, so you should have lived experience. You should have someone from advocacy. So there's no significant advocate sometimes in some of these panels. I'm not saying that in all the cases, but sometimes the selection of panel itself is the problem from the regulatory standpoint. How are we as consumers, because I would say consumers, not just clinicians, but we are users of this system, why are we not allowed to nominate some of these people with regulatory accolades to be the panel there? Yes, of course, by virtue of that, we will be submitting someone who's a bit biased, who they would say, or close contact, who knows you, knows your product. But certainly there needs to be some ways to do so. And I would say that, I don't want to take up too much time here, but I would say that I think that with this new age, new adopters or ongoing adopters of new technology for people living with chronic diseases in whatever innovation it is, these people who have a voice with an advocacy agency, consumer agency or advocates, these people will eventually be the drivers to pivot the change for innovation, and will eventually force it on the regulators themselves to rethink and remodel their decision-making processes and steps here. Because eventually, I think this is going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years, even as soon as that in Australia, that especially in diabetes, and especially in subpopulations of diabetes like type 1, for example, it will eventually force regulators to rethink and relook, and eventually they will have to allow some things. For example, like one of my strategies would be the ability for companies or innovators out there to submit their proposal with a nomination of someone that they think would be in their camp as well, not just from a company standpoint, but from a disease or chronic disease standpoint. Because the things that I tend to do are in non-communicable diseases and in maternal child health. And so I'll probably stop at that anyway. I've taken up too much time.
Yeah, thank you, Densearn. Simon put some links in the chat that can be interesting for many of you, that there are others who are also trying to help open source go through the regulation and maybe to give some materials to the regulators for them to progress in the right direction. I mean, that's a long and slow process. I mean, it involves a lot of legal experts and the like. I know that the 2020 event in which Renza was the host mentioned this issue, and what I remember was that you guys back then invited the TGA to come to this panel, but they didn't even respond. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Which was interesting because it's, I've been to the American Diabetes a number of times where there's like diabetes media group about and run by diabetes advocates, and there is very regular engagement with FDA at that meeting, and really strong links between the advocacy community and the FDA. We just don't seem to necessarily have that here with the TGA, unfortunately. But I hate to throw a spanner in the works, but I'm going to here is, do we really want these open source technologies regulated? I think that that's one of the questions that I'm not a developer of this, so I don't have any real right, I guess, to have a discussion around this, but I do want to raise it because, I rebuild my loop quite regularly because there are constant updates and upgrades and new features and, something that it can do now that integrates with this or that integrates with that. I don't think that a regulator can keep up with the speed of user-led innovation. And so what does that mean? Does it mean that we go through a process, we have something regulated 2 years down the track, by which time it is totally obsolete in terms of what people who are keeping up to date with their open source devices, what happens? And I'm curious. So when I'm having these conversations with people, I was recently speaking with somebody who was all excited about trying to get open, DOA-APS regulated and then commercialized. And I was like, well, firstly, I don't know that you can decide that you want to make this commercial because you didn't develop it, number one. But number two, how is a regulator going to keep up with the level of innovation and the level of advancement that happens in these communities? Because I'm not sure. I'm genuinely curious to know how that might happen. David might have a better idea considering he is actually a developer here, but I'm very confused as to how that might look in reality. I'm a bit skeptical about
it. There's a couple of points there. I guess we've got there are some commercial products that have gone through the regulators to be some closed loop systems. But as you say, they are a long way behind the open source things because the open source things keep moving along. A lot of the technology we have in the open source stuff, the licenses on them basically say that someone could take that and commercialize a product out of it and run it through the regulators. And I'm working with some companies who might be interested in that. And we're doing all sorts of clinical trial work, just gathering evidence. But in the meantime, whatever's taken through the regulators in terms of a product, I'd be really sad if that suddenly meant at some point that this whole class of devices was somehow suddenly regulated and the open source people were suddenly legally shut off from doing things. That would be suboptimal, is not the word I would use. But whatever products go through the regulators is never going to be bleeding edge.
Simon, I'd like to hear your take on this one.
I'm running Ubuntu long-term service on my computer, and it means I don't get the bleeding edge GNOME, and I don't get, but right here on my computer, sitting right here, this is where I want to have a degree of stability. Out there, I'm itching to run the beta of the new Ubuntu that comes out, and I think there's people who want. So there's people Densearn, is it? There's people who Densearn want to be able to say, I actually want to be able to recommend something, you know, and if he was able to recommend a product from a year ago, like if he was able to recommend, if the open source product was snapshotted a year ago, put through a 12-month regulatory approach, is there a group of people today who could benefit from where it was at a year ago and could come in to see Dr. CO and he would go, here, I'm actually allowed to recommend this and I'm actually allowed for you to have this. And then every, you know, Ubuntu long-term services on a 2-year checkpointing cadence. You know, if there are some people who if that open source product through the community, not, you know, was able to go through, if the regulatory burden was able to be made simpler, more understandable, more aligned with software development, actually have our GitHub processes actually spin off, you know, some of the regulatory work and have some of that stuff automated, then you could actually have the regulatory approach less burdensome on software developers and make it so that we don't hate it as much. And if that then was able to then go through a checkpointing process where every 2 years, it just goes through a regulatory approach, maybe there's a grant that can actually fund, you know, just some of the, you know, fund some of the regulators who are happy to help, you know, then you've got this 2-year cadence where people who don't want to be on the bleeding edge, but want to be able to go to a doctor and not necessarily understand how it all works, but want to be able to have something that someone can say this is okay. Then Densearn's okay to go, yeah, I'm allowed to give you this one. I'm actually allowed to approve this. I'm not going to lose my medical license for doing so, you know. And all of a sudden you have a scenario where it's not someone coming along and saying, oh, we know better than the community, rah, rah, rah. It's actually, it's just making the regulatory burden simpler, if that's possible, which I hope it might be. And yeah, I don't know, like it's, that's it. And I mean, I in the open source community, I opt on my working machine to use a 2-year cadence. Like I am behind, you know, the new long-term service comes out on the 18th. And I think I'm even going to wait until the 6 months after that, until the first patch comes out before I run that on my work machine, you know, but when I, you know, and so that's, and I'm choosing to do that. Anyway, that's mine.
No, Jasmine pointed out on the chat the tide pool thing. So first, the fact that tide pool actually gone through that. So I to be honest, I don't know exactly the detail technically of what tide pool is doing in terms of scope and what hardware it is compatible with and this sort of question. I haven't looked in detail, but they have been through that with the FDA. And to me, that I mentioned at the beginning this whole AI pilot program from the FDA, because for me the question is not, no, should we try to make this open source project fit into the regulation? For me, the problem is more that regulation anyway, as they are, they won't stand the time. No. At the same time, we have this medical regulation that's existing, but at the same time, the whole of Europe are setting up crazy, huge regulation for AI in general. And I mean, soon every second medical product that gets out will have an AI component in that. So they will have to abide to those regulations as well. It's all about transparency and explainability. When the medical regulations, they are not explainable. They don't make sense. They are artificial. They are based on classifications that doesn't mean anything. They are based on arbitrary rules and all this sort of thing. So to me, it's more a matter of what to learn from those challenges today with open source technology in a regulated environment, and how to take that as an input for a larger project of designing the regulation we need for the future, because we need new regulation. So it's the scope of government action on technology needs to be revisited. You know, the board of Facebook were discussing messing up the mental health of their users, and that's not regulated. But people who are benevolently trying to put transparent medical product out with full disclosure of the risk, officially they are illegal. I mean, something is wrong. The whole regulatory thing needs to be rethought. And my interest with ATHT is not to say, okay, let's tweak a little bit the regulatory process so we can have an open source license regulated. It's really know how can we revisit the whole concept of regulation. And that's what I was saying earlier. Access to evidence, transparency of evidence, and making sure people can make their own informed decision based on solid evidence, regardless of the technology, whether it's medical or not. But maybe I'm a bit too crazy, I don't know.
I'll just point out that there's plenty of data these days about COVID and vaccines and masks. And it's good to have the data. It's not apparently sufficient to get people to behave in their best interests.
Yeah, can I bring up a point here about regulatory approval is only one bit, but reimbursement is perhaps the other one. And maybe the reimbursement will drive the, I'll call it the prize for the, you know, David Burns, not just to develop the code, but then to bring it out. And, you know, there's a reason that pharmaceutical companies spend more on sales and marketing than they do on research. It's to get that message out there, to get everyone better controlled. And maybe reimbursement is perhaps the bit that we also need to talk about hand in glove with regulatory approval.
Yeah, and those pathways are so separate, so separate that it, you know, we end up with getting things through a regulatory process and then them never actually getting to the hands of the people who need them. And we hear that time and time again. We're seeing it today with CGM in Australia. As I said, 50% of people with type 1 diabetes can't access CGM in a subsidized way, and that's, you know, and I think and it was mentioned that, you know, and once they turn 21 and have had subsidized access, suddenly they're not eligible anymore, and that is really just ridiculous. And not only that, but then we also have the latest living evidence guidelines come out that actually recommend CGM for all people with type 1 diabetes and for people with type 2 diabetes on insulin, I think, as well. And so, you know, we've suddenly got, well, this is what the guidelines are saying. These are approved devices, but hey, you've got to get out on your own and try and afford them, and they're not cheap. Or we'll give them to a few people, but then we're going to take them off you anyway as you get older, or if you stop trying to have a baby, or if you've had your baby, or if you are no longer on a healthcare card. Like, there's all these, you know, I mean, it's the jumping through hoops that is required by people living with diabetes is another full-time job on top of living with diabetes, on top of the full-time jobs that we have.
I agree, yes. The evidence from clinical practice guidelines would state that, and I agree, our hands are tied as clinicians because of the reimbursement pathway. And just to add to what Duncan said, and the other bit about open source as well, how does that affect medical insurers as well is another thing. So that's something that the regulators will look at, and something for consumers to also need to consider when adopting technologies such as this, because there will be a sub-pocket, you know, even if it's one out of the millions who adopt such technology, and then there was an insurance claim of some sort. As soon as such open source software is implemented into a regulated device, that device itself is rendered not regulated. And from an insurer standpoint, they may be able to stake their claims. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, when you use open software that is not approved as a software as medical device in whatever geography or region that you're using it, would that lead to, this is a question actually, I'm not saying this is a statement, this is a question that I had, that you know, regulators would certainly look at that. I know that for certain, because when we submit some questions, these are some of it, the question is always, how would insurers view this? So I guess the definition from a regulatory standpoint to me, when I was faced or posed with that question, sounds like the regulators themselves are not certain, how does this change the approved product? But I can tell you this, for example, worst case scenario, I always do this in terms of driving, for example, because I see a lot of truck drivers getting approval, right? So pardon me if I keep using this as an example, but if your company hires a truck driver who has type 1 diabetes using such technology, the company themselves would want to not reimburse and use an insurance or insurer to claim this. The insurer, so I can tell you, defensive here, everyone on the defensive here, and those who do not want to fork out cash will eventually have to pin it on a poor diabetic patient here, who unfortunately has great control, but the accident has got nothing to do with their blood sugar here. But because the current metrics might say the sugar of 3.9 is worrisome. So that's a question that I would have, and I might leave that at this, and something for us to ponder upon. Because from a regulatory standpoint, I think regulators are scrutinizing hypoglycemia too much. That 0.1 would not mean too much sometimes. From a regulatory standpoint, where does it stand when you use open source technology in already approved regulated products? Does it change or break the regulatory standpoint? And from a consumer, should they be aware how it changes? Because at the moment, I don't have any answer for this.
The whole regulatory environment is set up basically so there's someone to blame. The sponsor of the product through the regulators. So that has to be an entity of some sort, and there's going to be financial risk behind that. That's on a separate issue. You mentioned the example of 3.9 or 70 to the US people and 0.1. Where did the 0.1 come from?
Sorry, I didn't.
You mentioned talking about time in range. I think you mentioned like 0.1 in hypo or whatever.
It was just an arbitrage right, okay. That I quoted. A regulator, from a regulatory standpoint, might just quote that there's a difference of 0.1, which distinguishes between normal glycemia and hypoglycemia.
Okay.
Change the way a regulator without any prior diabetes knowledge or lived experience, will that change their perception in making a stance?
Yeah, just looking at the clinical standards of care, the international consensus on time in range was talking about, and it's trying to set goals to keep people safe for long-term health largely. So they're talking about trying to keep the glycemia within range at least 70% of the time, and there's actually several levels of hypo, and there's certain percentages. Now, ideally, these would be all zero down the bottom. And when the regulators say, all right, to be approved, it's going to have to be zero down the bottom, everything gets suddenly harder.
Yeah, agreed.
Yes, thank you very much, David and Densearn. It has been 2 hours, which I'm more than open to keep the meeting open if people still want to discuss. That's really up to you. Otherwise, 2 hours may be enough in one go. Yeah, no more questions. So I really want to thank Jasmine a lot for a great presentation. Of course, all the panel members and everyone was volunteering their time, of course. No money was involved into the making of this meeting. I really thank you all the audience as well for jumping in and all the great questions and discussions. So that was recorded. You should have had a little warning when you jumped in. I will save the recording in the same Google Drive. I will try to save the chat. I will try not to mess up this time because there's a lot of great notes in the chat. So I will not close the meeting while I save that to make sure, but people, you are free to leave if you want to. Thank you very much, everyone. It was great to have you all.
Thank you. Thanks so much. See you later. Bye. Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks, Pierre. Thanks. Thank you.
Good to meet you all.
I'll have you again soon, I'm sure.
I've got to go as well, but thank you so much for running this, and it was lovely to meet you all and have a great discussion.